computer. Well, welcome to my presentation, Hermeneutics, Surviving a World of Large Language Model AI. This comes out of my work with my students at UCW, plus my work on ethics of AI, and me trying to figure out where do we go in the world today. AI is challenging so much about what we do, how we do it, providing new opportunities, but creating problems as well. So the goal here is to understand what is happening in AI and then use the academic tools of hermeneutics to help us unpack how we might respond more effectively. I think, as you'll see, hermeneutics makes a lot of sense once you understand it, even though the concept is new. To most folk, it's been around for centuries, and you can see that it's kind of built into much of the way we think and do things. But this gets it out in front. To start then. Why? So here's the problem. Large language model AI is changing the way people think. I've noticed students making mistakes in the classroom that they've never made before. They are just unbelievably finding it more difficult to do certain kinds of thinking that were practically automatic. And so now, so the question I started asking is, well, what is going on? And what I observe in my students is that it's reducing critical thinking. Their capacity to analyze things appears to be going down. Their biases are being reinforced. And and this is just deadly. They are passing along falsehoods on the basis of the AI without actually even thinking about what's going on. The inaccuracies are um, uh, quite significant. It's making them harder to follow directions. And I'm not sure about this last one, but it appears to me that it is reducing their ability to communicate with each other effectively. That is, their conversations are being reduced in what can I say? The co-learning that goes on between students. It doesn't seem to be happening the way it would or has in the past. So these are significant problems. And the question is, well, what's going on here? So first, a few key terms. AI, I mean artificial intelligence. LLM stands for large language model, and that's like ChatGPT, Perplexity, Copilot. There are a good number of them and more all the time. They're increasingly used as a tool for information search, that is all kinds of research. And because it's an amazing tool for research, you can find things that you simply could not find any other way, are very handy and easy to get to using one of the AI tools. And then on the productive side, for any communications that you're trying to produce, business communication, marketing materials, whatever, particularly in my case, student projects, it makes a tremendous difference in terms of the quality of output that people can produce. I've noticed immediately that the quality of the language that students are using has gone way up. I mean, this is a big plus, but the quality of the thinking involved, that's the problem. So to give you a sense of what's going on, why LLMs AI are a problem, I want you to look at this model that I've constructed. Kind of picks apart the process. The issue here is that it's a probabilistic outcome. That is what AI is doing. That's a black box there in the middle. What AI is doing is producing programmed computer output from a very complex process. And we don't know what that process is. So I want to get inside of that process a little bit. So if you start at the top, or we could start at the bottom, but starting at the top, we've got the user at the top. There we go. There's the user. The user has things that they want to learn, and that becomes the input side for this black box, the large language model AI. But one of my notes is in that computer input, it's a simplified input. That is, you lose much of human communications, particularly the intentions and the context of the communication. They're simply not going into the box. And then on the other side of the box, you get the output. after the AI is processed, the input, output, which comes back to users. So that's what we see when we're talking about working with an AI. But behind it and inside of it are a lot of other processes. So to start at the very bottom, or start in the inside, sorry, so let's start with the inside. So inside an AI is a learning process. That AI is continually developing higher skills at probabilistic analysis of associating things, putting things together based on your use, based on the use of other people. So it's ongoing improvement. And you'll notice that if you're working with it, it will track its own output to you and your input to get more and more refined in terms of the answers in any particular sequence. So this is ongoing. These AI are, in a certain limited kind of sense, getting smarter all the time. But that's not the issue. What's more the issue is how this works and what it's drawing on. So what's critical to this is there are two sets of algorithms. We have input algorithms and output algorithms. That is, the input algorithms are what the designers of the AI have used to interpret the input from users. That is, how do they pick things apart? How do they create associations from that input to create a framework for producing the output? And then on the other side, it has output algorithms, algorithms that take that input and combine it with the vast data sources that they have available to produce something that appears meaningful to the user. So we have input out algorithms, we have output algorithms, and they go and they create the dynamic within which the AI functions. Okay. I said they have vast resources of data. That is, they're drawing upon the vast resources of available human productions. That is, all the things that we can interpret through machines, basically everything available on the internet. And that becomes the resources from which the materials are selected. But there are many other human productions, go down here, that are not available on the internet. Either they're too new or they aren't text, they aren't in a form that the computer recognizes, or they could be as simple as a conversation between people anywhere. Most cultural communications, most communications are actually not available to the AI. So it's this process of they're all human productions. There's a selection bias, that is, only those that can be turned into machine text, basically through the internet, become the available human productions, and those, again, it's whatever they can get their hands on, become available, so that there's this reduction. And then what's really important to recognize is from available human productions, when we're reading them, you're listening to them, watching them, we're also very carefully assessing them for context and intentions that gets lost when the AI is selecting them. That is, the selection bias is towards a kind of mechanical content rather than the living, rich human content. So when you're looking at an AI, the user output, the user is getting this output. So they're looking at this stuff and they're getting a product of a machine that has limited access to human productions, that is a limited access to everything human beings do. Okay, so there's the serious problems. Then what we've also noted, and it doesn't take much reading to realize that there are design biases in those algorithms. Those algorithms come out of the people who are designing it. They have their own cultural biases, their own language biases, their own intuitions that inform the way those algorithms are constructed. So we've got this very complex process that we can't see, it's not transparent, that is producing this output that we get up here. So that's what's going on. That's the background. What does that mean? Okay, so now let's get into the problems that's really start emerging. So AI uses biased language. And this isn't because the users are setting out to have biases. It's that the biases are simply built into language and the culture of the programmers. The fact that they're trying to do things simply means that they are applying the biases that they've learned. Um, then, as noted, the material also isn't all language, it simply comes from selected sources. Okay, then this takes some very sophisticated, and this is where we get to hermeneutic analysis, um, understanding that all language is gendered. It does not matter what you're saying, there are gender implications built into it. All language has implications for what men and women are and how they differ, what their functions are in relationship to the world. It can be a very clear, strong sense or a very weak background sense, but it's there. Similarly, for class and culture, these things are carried in all language. And it's primarily functions below the level of conscious thought. So, for example, an example I bring up in class is if you think about the concept of objectivity, well, objectivity is about object orientations. Well, we know that object orientations is a more masculinist way of thinking that if you women have a tendency to think more in relational terms. Does it mean women cannot think objectively? No. Does it mean men can't think relationally? No. But there is a tendency when we start looking at language to try for objective functions. Our computers function around objective functions because, quite frankly, relational dynamics are really hard to assess. It's very complex stuff. And thus, we are losing a perspective that is more feminine within the framework of language as a whole. This has been noted by academics for decades now, that academic language tends to be masculinist in its core, that it privileges male ways of thinking over female. And some very sophisticated analysis of this has been done. Well, the AI is simply picking up on exactly this bias that we already are aware of that's in the language itself. And as I said, similarly, class and culture are carried within the framework of the language itself. Okay, so it carries the biases in the language. It's got other problems. Intentionality. AI violates the fundamental necessity of intentionality in communications. That is, we interpret everything that we hear, see, read in terms of the intentions of the author. It's typically it's implicit, but we have a pretty good sense from experience of what is going on with any particular kind of intentionality. It's like my intentionality is to inform, and that makes a lot of sense. What is the intentionality of AI? And the answer is it has no intentions. There's no intentionality at all. It's just a word salad of probabilistic associations. The only intentionality, and this is a very clear slant that's built into the machine, is that the words have to be presented in such a way that they appear reliable. That is, if they don't appear reliable, we ignore them and we'll ignore the AI. So there's been a lot of work done to make sure that the output looks like human output. I was just reading an analysis of Chat GPT-3. We're now currently on version 4. And one of the critiques is that the output didn't seem human, and therefore people didn't like it. And the big shift between 3 and 4 is to make it seem more human. That is, to make it seem like this is a human being, a reliable human being that you're talking to, and therefore you will trust it more. But note that this is a bias, a slant that's built in, not something that is neutral. The words are not in any way neutral, but they don't have the kind of intentionality that we humans attribute to things that come from a person's intentions, a person's goals, or a sense of what a person's trying to accomplish. Similarly, AI violates context. All meaning is constructed through the observed context. This is what provides missing pieces or the framework within which the pieces are organized. That is, AI has a machine context, not a human one. And that means it's responding to the human context of the input data, but it's not providing its own context. You have no sense of where is this information coming from? What is the selection process? We don't get the perspective or the slant. or the macro view, the theory that is behind it. All communication is locked within a kind of theoretical perspective. I mean, everything I say is locked within a very academic kind of perspective. It's not hard to figure that out. It's what I am, it's what I'm trying to do. But what is the machine doing? And given that academic perspective is very Western, very masculine, class oriented, it's upper class, educated, all of those are, you can tell they're implicit in what I'm doing. But what's implicit in the AI? How do you understand the context, get those missing pieces? The answer is you can't. Anything you do is simply your construction, not what the machine is actually doing. You don't know what it has put together or why. Oh, and this one is just deadly. That is facticity. All meaning is based on the possibility of facts. That is, we trust that inside of every conversation, every piece of it, there is some kind of factual content or the possibility of factual content. We rely on that to construct the meaning. We're looking for the anchors, the tools, the things that root the words in something outside of just the conversation itself. Now, and that's essential for our confidence that there is meaning present. So, and I give you a short definition of a fact just because facts themselves are understood sometimes to be problematic. This is a constructivist response based on some philosophy. So a fact is an answer to a stable problem that is socially robust and existentially reliable. We can pick that apart in the questions if you wish to. But here's the problem with AI. AI reports high probability facts. Okay, it does. There's no question. A lot of what it produces is fact-based. But it isn't all facts. That is, there are low probability facts. That is, facts that are facts, but don't show up very often. Well, they just get overlooked given the probabilistic models that the AI is looking for. So there may be facts and counterfacts, but the counterfacts, if they're of lower probability, simply don't get into the machine's output. And then because it's a probabilistic machine, it actually constructs the appearance of facts at times. This is the well-known problem of AI hallucinations. It creates something that looks like a fact, that looks reasonable, because it has to look reasonable, but is in fact fact-free. And how that works is because it's a probabilistic string, that is, the AI connects this to this to this to that. Well, it's probabilities all the way through, but that doesn't mean that this down here is actually connected to this up here. That is, there's a probabilistic string, but it zigs and zags all over the place, and it doesn't mean that the outcome is in fact factual. So now we have a hallucination, but a hallucination designed to look like a fact. It's a problem. So here's what's going on. The normal rules of human communication do not apply to AI output. That is, we're facing real obstacles. There's a persuasive slant to everything, but it's merely to trusting the machine. This is not good, as we should be suspicious of the machine. We understand that the intentions are benign, which is also a problem. But you see, that's the way human beings approach all of our communications. We assume a benign intent until we get indications of something else. We kind of have to, otherwise we couldn't listen to anything. But that means we also approach the AI output assuming it's benign, when in fact it's not. Another problem is machine statements are inherently understood to be factual. This is something I was taught years ago when I was taking my first computer science courses, and we were told, be extremely cautious with your programming, because what happens is anything that comes out of a computer is more likely to be trusted than the same things written on a piece of paper. That is, if you write a bunch of numbers on a piece of paper and generate those same numbers with the machine, people are likely to think the machine generated numbers are true, and these, they maybe or maybe not. That is, there's this brain skew that human beings have that we just trust machines over what's obviously a human construct. So that's another problem. And then a basic human problem, and this is true not just for AI output, is the biases are not perceived. We require training. And that's just general. Human beings, we're not really good at seeing the biases in the language that we use. They're unconscious below the surface, and therefore we're really bad at seeing the biases in the AI language. Consequences, humans are vulnerable to terrible thinking when interacting with AI. It doesn't mean terrible thinking is inherent, but that we become extremely vulnerable to it. So, what I want to do is take a step back and look at a theoretical perspective called hermeneutics and see what it has to offer this situation. I think it has quite a bit, and let's look at that then. So, what is hermeneutics? Hermeneutics is the academic methodology for the study of meaning. That is, these are the tools that have been developed to try and figure out how do things come to mean what they seem to mean? What kinds of meaning are present in any communication? It's tied very closely to the study of rhetoric, but it's slightly different. Rhetoric is looking at the way language itself is put together. Hermeneutics is simply trying to figure out, well, what does it mean? The origin of this is actually it's centuries old. It comes from the study of sacred texts, where people were trying to figure out what the prophets have said, what does it mean? Because as cultures change over time, as words change over time, the meaning becomes harder and harder to understand. But having been developed hundreds of years ago for the study of sacred texts, it's become a standard tool, okay, then in theology and religious studies, but also philosophy and anthropology. These are fields where people are working with this stuff all the time. Feminist studies use a lot of hermeneutic tools. So it's like there are lots of folk out there who are working with this, but it's still not that well known. The likelihood is before this presentation, none of you had heard of the word hermeneutics, even though people like me had to take whole courses in it in our graduate programs. But yeah. So if we start digging into hermeneutics, hermeneutics is about looking at meaning. And then to do that, we really spend a lot of time in the field looking at concepts. What does a concept mean? And this is a little bit tricky. That's why I have this image of a virus there. I thought that's what a concept looks like. So that's a diagram of a virus, but it gives you a sense of of concept. A concept has a core, but it's got all these other things poking out of it that make it complex. And then where it gets really complex is when you start looking at all those things around it. Some of them are supplied by the sender, some by the receiver, and some by the context. That is, if you take a concept and rip it out of its context, it starts meaning something different. Different receivers actually understand it differently. Different senders are understanding it differently. So that when you're looking at a concept, have to look at the process by which it moves between its history and its present use and the context. All of those become significant pieces. Excuse me. So the result there is when you start looking at it, though, you've got a lot of things going on in a concept, hundreds of components based on social use, history, personal use, and experience. That is, it turns out that a concept is not something that you find in a dictionary. Well, you can, and it's not a bad place to start, but a dictionary perhaps gives you the core, but it doesn't give you all of the richness of the actual use, how things are being used in a particular context. I've got some examples coming up in a little bit. Critical to this is then understanding concepts as a human process. Concepts exist for reasons. They don't drop out of dictionaries. They are about resolving problems. This is the philosopher Michael Myers' work. So he talks about the apodictic. We look for concepts that permanently resolve problems, or apocritical, they immediately resolve it, or problematic, they clarify the problem. And anyway, so we can dig into that if anybody wants to in more depth. But the core here is that people have problems, and we develop concepts to resolve those problems, to provide solutions at different levels that allow us to move on and develop our thinking and our action. So that's Meyer. Foucault points out, though, that uh, in resolving problems, which he agrees with, those concepts reflect human positions and needs, and as he's particularly famous for, power structures. That is, every concept is something that has worked to support a particular human power structure, particular class, particular group, particular persons, and how they have worked to maintain and enhance their position in terms of social capacities, social resources available, social conditions, so that every single concept has emerged because it succeeded in helping a particular human group advance their own causes. So concepts are not neutral. They emerge from historical circumstances in support of particular people and individuals. So we've got Meyer, they're about resolving problems, which is really an interesting uh, collection. And then Foucault looking at this issue of, well, whose problems are they resolving? Um, so when we're understanding concepts, then we have to look at them as reflecting what's going on in context, like they're gendering. The who is always gendered. The who is always representing a class. The who always represents a culture. So the who developing these concepts are people with all of the biases that they've got based on their position in life, based on the way they've experienced life. So the concepts are coming from that and working effectively to help people in various class, gender, and culture positions function effectively. And it's all embedded in the concept. And then, as I've also noted, um, much of meaning is carried in the demeanor. That is, how it's presented. Do you have a pause? And what does a pause do to the person who's responding? What does a pause indicate? Because a pause can indicate giving you time to reflect. It can reflect the issue of not sure what they're saying. So there's so many things that the demeanor, just in a simple pause, carries in terms of how the material should be interpreted. And then again, what is the context? The same words used in a university mean something very different if they're used in a pub, particularly after half a dozen drinks. And vice versa. The language in a pub after half a dozen drinks is not the language you would use in a university. That's the context itself is really important to the way you use them and what they mean. I mean, students could take lecture notes and talk about them in a pub, but then they become a point of laughter, the craziness of what they're learning, rather than concepts to take seriously, which is what they meant in the classroom. So the context itself changes the way you're supposed to understand what these words mean. So to give you some sense, I have a few phrases that all demonstrate hermeneutics in action. That is, how do you interpret these phrases or actions? I would like you to do this on your own. Okay, that's a nice simple statement, except is it a punishment? I would like you to do this on your own. Or is it a reward? I'd like you to do this on your own. Referring to I can see your competence and your capability. It's time to step out. That is, that's the context. You were served coffee out of a chipped cup with a picture of a transport truck and Joe's Trucking on the side. What do you think of that? I mean, again, uh, if you are at the Hyatt in downtown Vancouver and you are served that way, you're going to go, what on earth? But if you're out on camping with a bunch of friends, it means something completely different and maybe completely acceptable. And again, this phrase, you don't understand, could be a statement of fact from a prof to a student. It could be, well, a statement of you don't understand, also from prof to student, meaning listen up, figure this out, and so on. I like the last one. The children need attention because that one is so heavily gendered. Women tend to take that as okay, what do I need to do to help the children? Where are the children? What? Whereas a man thinks of it as how do I find a woman who can take care of the children? And again, then is it coming from a man saying the children need attention? Or from another woman, the children need attention. Again, it's going to be a completely different interpretation depending on who it's coming from. And then, are you out on a playground? Is this in a school? What's the context? Again, so that you can see that the meaning of the words is not in the words, it's in the context, it's in the way they're presented. And that each of us is creating a specific meaning based on our own experiences, where we're from, what we've experienced as men, women, our particular class, culture, education. All of those have profound impacts then on how we interpret things. What we really want is knowledge. And the problem here is that knowledge only comes when we have accurate framing. That is, we want to move from the content to being able to understand what is effective meaning, what is really going on here. And that means something even more, that what hermeneutics tells us is we have to have a very clear sense of the broader perspective. What theories are at work in the materials and the environment that produce them? So when we're starting to look at, as I said, those statements on the last slide, you need to know where are they from? What's the framework? You have to have some sense of what is trying to go on there before you can know what it really means. But another side of that becomes then of being aware of your own blind spots. Um, because when you're trying to interpret that broader perspective, if the perspective matches our own, it becomes hard to see. The more different it is, the easier it is to see. We need to become aware again, and this is something feminists have been pointing out for decades, of our own gender, class, and culture, because without our own awareness, we can't really see that broader perspective that gives us a sense of knowledge. But there's some other facts that we've tended to overlook that AI is really bringing to attention, that to do good interpretation, you actually have to have a good general fact knowledge. That's something we just assumed in the past, but now it's becoming quite clear that we need a good general background in order to be able to interpret what we're hearing. And increasingly, we need to know how good facts are obtained. That is, we have to start building our critical capacities for how a particular group, culture, whatever, is actually obtaining the facts that are essential for knowledge. So, last section, hermeneutic answers to the AI problem. So, I have been prompts are the starting place. You have to work with your prompts to really make sure that the AI is producing the most effective output you can, which means starting with hermeneutic awareness, know your own position, understand the basic facts and framework that you need for that perspective. That is, you can't go in blind, not knowing what you're trying to accomplish and who you are, or the basic framework of what the answers should look like. The more of that you've got, the more effectively you can develop a good prompt. Then in doing so, be specific, use facts. AI is probabilistic reasoning. The more facts you give it, the more it can anchor its probabilities in things you actually care about and want to know. So the more facts you put in, the stronger the results are, and more likely they will in fact be fact-based. Then what is also important is to apply multiple input perspectives. That is, you need your AI to have adopted a perspective. If you don't give it a perspective, it'll go to a kind of neutralist, middle of the road position. Yeah, but what does neutralist, middle of the road means? It means something that reflects kind of ordinary, relatively educated Western white male perspectives. And if you think in those terms, you realize that is in fact literally what you're getting. That's where it goes. So you have to require that it give you multiple viewpoints in terms of what you want. So I'm feminist, Marxist, ideological, religious. By requiring it take a particular viewpoint, you now start pushing out the probabilities in particular directions. And once you've got multiples, you can begin to see more effectively what is actually going on. And that means rephrasing and trying again. That is, come at it from multiple points of view. A simple effort gets you wrong. you need to try complex thinking, multiple perspectives, and doing it again from multiple angles to really get output that is going to be reasonable. And then be suspicious about that output. That is, the fact that you've done a good job on the input still doesn't mean you have managed to make the AI do what you need. So you need to be able to look at that output and go, okay, what's going on here? What the concepts that are in the answers, where did they come from? Are they the only concepts possible? What culture do they represent? As always, check the facts. You have to check the facts because AI will hallucinate. Even when you've given it good input, doesn't mean it'll stick with the input. It'll may mix in a falsehood in with a bunch of true statements. I typically find when I'm running complicated questions past, there'll be some trivial stuff, some wrong stuff, and often some really quite insightful, very helpful stuff, all lumped together. There's no way of separating them without some very careful analysis to try and figure out which is fiction, which is fact, and which is actually valuable fact. You've got to look at the language for gender, class, and culture. Big problem here being that very few people are trained to look for gender, class, and culture, but they're embedded in everything. Look for the emotional tone. There's always emotional tone in whatever human beings do. AI is trying for a neutralist tone, but that means, again, a more particular class, culture being represented. Yeah, but it's still not emotion free. Human beings don't respond well to emotion free language. We need emotion to really pick up on it and make it make sense. There's a persuasive component. Might not be a big one, but what is it? There's always a moral component, a certain sense of rightness and wrongness built into the language. And then finally, there's always something missing. What is it? Ask that question. Force yourself when looking at that input to say, there is something wrong here. I don't know what it is, but there's always something wrong. So you have to be very careful. Do additional research, check against other sources, check with other people, try and do some cultural analysis. So many things that you need to do to really understand and work effectively with that output. And then finally, know yourself. And one of my profs once said that hermeneutics is not about understanding your materials, it's about understanding yourself. That he says, ultimately, you never know what something means. All you can ever really know is who you are. And so one of the important things to recognize is here is there is always a user bias. All of us emerge from cultures, have expectations, have a certain knowledge base, and that means we're all looking for a particular kind of answer. And once we get an answer that reflects what we're looking for, we have a terrible tendency to approve it. That is, think, yes, this is a great answer, not because it is in fact a good answer, but merely because it suits us, our class position, our gender, our cultural expectations. Once it hits those points, then we go, yes. So we have to then be aware of ourselves so again we can be more suspicious of that output and how it's trying to feed us what we want to hear, or we're getting what we want to hear, and we keep looking till we get what we want to hear, but we need to know who we are. So last slide summary. The hermeneutics of AI means knowing what you're looking for. I mean, you can't just ask questions without having a sense of the framework, sense of the facts. Two, prompt with as much knowledge as possible. You've got to put in real data in order to get to confine the AI to things that are closer to what is really appropriate. Ask for a perspective. Don't just put in your prompt. It needs to be a prompt based on a slant, a perspective that you can measure and analyze, because that's the only way you can really begin to understand how the data is being organized. Then check the output for the type of bias. You can do that. Check all the facts. Last, check your own expectations. Are you hearing what you want to hear, reading what you want to read, seeing what you want to see? Because if so, it's a good chance it's wrong. One of the hermeneutic keys is to always expect to be challenged. That is, if you don't find a meaning that challenges you, you probably have only found a meaning that confirms rather than enhances your knowledge. And the goal has to be to enhance knowledge, or there's no point in using AI. So check your own expectations. So at that point, we'll end this. I'll open it up to any questions. Just let me stop the recording.